As it may come as a surprise to some of you, but our favorite story does not start with its main character, but instead with the woman he loves, or more accurately, has a crush on. Rise Kamishiro would be no different than what you would think to be the average woman, and we would come to understand that Rise wants to avoid boredom at all costs. It comes really clear that the one thing that she values above everything else is her own freedom, and given her background, we can easily see why. Before, her life wasn't in her own hands, but now, given the opportunity, she can finally do exactly what she wants every single day in her life. Rise would even go as far as to call ghouls cowardly lions that are willingly caged. And this would give you more insight into understanding why she is doing what she's doing now in the beginning of the story. Rise does not want to be caged because all of her life she has been in a cage. All thanks to how much her family would try to control her. And this is why she is so hell-bent now. Just like the current society that takes place in Tokyo Ghoul, which is often described as a warped bird cage, Rise would end up going against society, her fellow ghouls, and the many ghoul investigators that would dare to cross her path. Rise is tired of being caged by her family, society, and most importantly, all of her allies, which ultimately leads her to wanting another fresh start in her life, simply because she is bored. All the while, our main character, Ken Kaneki, begins to attract Rise's attention. And so, Tokyo Ghoul would begin with Kaneki's perspective, with him spending his usual days with his best friend Hide, drinking coffee. And just like how Kaneki caught Rise's attention, she immediately catches Kaneki's attention. Kaneki would order coffee and be on Teku specifically so that he could gawk at Rise all day long. The things you do for love. With that being said, Kaneki begins to notice that Rise just so happens to be reading the same exact book as him, and Rise would inevitably do the same. And upon noticing each other reading the same book, Kaneki and Rise hit things off well and end up even going on a date. How romantic. At least, that's what I would be saying if Rise wasn't a monster actually trying to eat Kaneki the entire time. When Kaneki caught her attention, it wasn't out of love, it was because she was hungry. I guess it was looking a little appetizing. And so, Rise wants to tear him to shreds and eat him alive. Unfortunately, her hopes and dreams are thwarted because she gets crushed by steel beams in a freakish accident. And so, Ken Kaneki survives a ghoul attack, but at the price of something big. At the price of his own humanity. Kaneki begins to live his everyday life, but he soon begins to notice some really odd changes, especially in terms of his diet. After eating his favorite food, which is hamburger steak, Kaneki begins to feel like that food itself tastes terrible. Slowly but surely, Kaneki begins to realize everything in his life changing right in front of his eyes. And while experiencing drastic hunger pains, Kaneki finds himself outside only to witness a murder happening before his very eyes. And when witnessing such a thing, Kaneki immediately runs away out of fear, and then soon after, with the very thought of what just happened, he begins to drool. After being in a state of shock and confusion, he begins to try and continue his day-to-day life. And to take his mind off the crazy situation he just experienced, he goes to a book signing. However, this does not go his way, and he gets stuck in a crowd of people where he begins to contemplate eating them. And soon after, he runs away to recollect his thoughts, and he begins to panic and take matters into his own hands by trying to gouge out his own kidney that ultimately turned him into a ghoul. And of course that does not work, and he finds himself face to face with the same ghoul that he found murdering someone. This ghoul also happens to be the waitress at the coffee shop that Kaneki would go to every day. She denies helping him at first, but the owner of the coffee shop chooses to take Kaneki in. He then begins to offer Kaneki the only thing that he can eat, and that would be human flesh. Kaneki takes this flesh home, and he begins to contemplate even eating it. Of course, that doesn't go too well, and so he starts rummaging through everything in his house, and he soon learns that coffee is the only thing that does not taste horrible to him. He then goes to the store to buy even more coffee to satiate his disgusting tastes. Another person buying coffee even goes as far as to recommend a specific coffee to Kaneki. While on the way home, Kaneki begins to smell something that makes him remember his mother's cooking. And so, being the hungry boy that he is, he would go and follow the scent, only to see a ghoul eating a human being. Unfortunately, this same ghoul feasting on a corpse gets killed by another ghoul who coincidentally was the person who recommended Kaneki a specific coffee brand. And things get ugly really fast. However, the waitress from Onteku comes to Kaneki's rescue and defeats the evil Starbucks drinker in one hit. Kaneki sees the corpse that's laying right in front of him, and he begins to reject the very fact that he's a ghoul, and Toka, unsatisfied with this, forces human flesh down Kaneki's throat. And Kaneki, after eating human flesh, is disgusted. And Toka does not take kindly to this at all, and tells him to try starving himself at least once. Afterwards, Kaneki returns to his daily life the next day, and he is greeted by his best friend, Hide. And they got quite a lot to talk about, and Kaneki begins to think about whether or not being a ghoul will affect his friendship with Hide in the slightest. Hide and Kaneki walk around on campus, and then, unfortunately, Kaneki runs into the same guy that he met last night that just tried to kill him. Imagine having this luck. Kaneki begins to immediately notice this same ghoul, and he freaks out, which really isn't the best thing to do in this situation. Kaneki and Hide end up spending the day with Nishio, and in doing so, Kaneki sees firsthand how a ghoul can blend in to their current society. And the most perfect example of this is how Nishio eats his food. Ghouls can eat human food, but he does it just fine, and no one will have a second thought about it. This works because Nishio is really good at swallowing his food. Don't worry, anyone can do it, it just takes practice. Just like anything in life, but as it turns out, Nishio was leading Hide and Kaneki into a trap just so he could eat Hide and finally get his revenge on Kaneki from what happened last night. Kaneki gets beat down and notices that Hide's life is in danger, and so his motivation for protecting his friend goes through the roof, and this allows him to fight Nishio back. And after defeating Nishio, Kaneki falls into a deep hunger and begins to want to eat his own friend. And Toka again comes to his rescue and prevents him from doing something that he would regret. Fortunately, Kaneki did not wound up eating his own friend, but the next day, he begins to learn how to make some Starbucks. No, this video is not sponsored. And for the most part, this would be Kaneki's training arc, where he would learn to blend into society just like a ghoul. And two other ghouls, with them being a mother and a child, would live at Onteku for protection. And this is where their problems would truly begin. Not from other ghouls, but from ghoul investigators. Humans themselves, which you could debate are actually worse off than ghouls. And in order to defend themselves, or rather deal with these investigators, ghouls wear masks so that they can keep their identity secret and continue to live in society. And Kaneki does just that. He meets Uda, and for the first time, he orders his own mask and begins to understand its importance. Even so, Kaneki would still dive deeper within life at Onteku and still practice trying to fit into society. And even then, he begins to learn how Onteku gets its own food supply, especially since they just don't simply hunt people down and eat them. As an alternative to this, Onteku ends up eating suicide victims. And here we begin to understand a little bit more about the people who work at Onteku, such as Yomo and Toka. Even so, they would make the choice to kill others if they really do need to eat. After the food run, we begin to see the mother that had recently joined Onteku walking alone, but as it turns out, she was actually mourning the death of her husband and visiting his grave. However, she doesn't really understand how dangerous her situation truly is because Rize actually ends up attracting the ghoul investigators to the ward that they're all currently living in. If investigators found her while she was doing this, she would have been killed and everyone at Onteku would have been put in danger. And the next day, the other side of the investigators is shown. So much so that even the investigators don't even consider digging up the grave of someone who could possibly be a ghoul. the investigators would consider it immoral, but with someone like Amon, he would believe that by doing this, it would be the true sense of justice that the CCG needs in order to take out any ghouls that threaten human lives. And Amon goes as far as to digging up a grave for the sake of what he believes to be right. And he believes that justice is morality in itself. And he claims that you cannot crush evil with morals. However, what Amon fails to realize is that they are simply just fighting evil with evil at that point, and giving rise to even more evil. And so Amon doing immoral things could lead to immoral consequences. Back to life at Onteku, Kaneki begins to bond with the daughter of the mother who recently joined Onteku, and he begins to understand that her name is Hinami. Kaneki begins to notice that he shares a similar interest with Hinami when it comes to the books that they read, and he picks up on her desire for intelligence, and he begins to teach her how to say specific words. Things seem to be looking up for both of the new members of Onteku. Unfortunately, the next day, they run into ghoul investigators, with the wife's memento that helped her through mourning the death of her husband being used as bait in order to kill their child, leaving the mother to sacrifice herself for her child like any mother would, while Mato would take advantage of this situation and find satisfaction in making this ghoul suffer, by making her suffer much like he has. Mato, without a doubt, makes others feel his same pain. Kaneki would find Hinami, but only to see the mother get executed before his very eyes. At this moment, he truly felt powerless. Of course, after such a tragedy, Onteku would be placed in a state of caution, where everyone would decide how to put their best foot forward. Toka wouldn't have the best reaction to what recently happened, and this would drive her to a state of wanting revenge, which is ultimately fueled by her character. She wants to take revenge because she has felt this same pain in the past. And while recognizing this feeling, when she was a child, she couldn't do anything, but now as she's grown older, she wants to take things into her own hands. As I said before, the evil acts of the investigators would only birth more evil from the ghouls themselves. And so Toka is inspired to enact her revenge. By doing nothing, in Toka's eyes, the lives that were lost would be just that. Nothing. And so she would immediately take action by killing another ghoul investigator. Unfortunately, in her acts for revenge, she only ends up killing innocent investigators that had nothing to do with the death of Hinami's mother. Toka barely makes it out alive with her assassination attempt, which also gives us further insight into the dynamic between humans and ghouls. Of course, we already know that they're two sides of the same coin, but unfortunately, whenever that coin flips, the life of an investigator or a ghoul is just taken away. A ghoul died and an investigator died immediately after because of it, and it really just reflects the complicated relationship between humans and ghouls alike. And everything that's happened affects Toka greatly. She feels as if ghouls like Hinami or her mother are unfairly killed, but little does she realize that she unfairly killed the lives of the investigators that she attacked. Oddly enough, what goes around comes around. And Kaneki, feeling inspired, comes to his own decisions and conclusion and wants to avenge Hinami's mother. Rather than just blending in with ghouls and living his original life, Kaneki chooses to become stronger. He wants to make decisions that will ultimately help everyone around him, leading him to train to become stronger. Kaneki would also eventually get his mask, which would allow him to actually face on the investigators and avoid suffering any major consequences to his actual life. Kaneki would find excitement in wearing this mask, and excitement when it comes to seeing the world from a ghoul's perspective. Toka and Kaneki begin to infiltrate the CCG's headquarters directly. Toka does this so that she can throw off their investigation and make it so that everyone at Onteku is safer, especially Hinami, who is at the greatest risk because the investigators know exactly what she looks like. Toka begins trying to pry the intelligence department, but she soon begins to realize that the CCG does not value ghoul lives in the slightest, and they have no problem killing them because they are viewed as monsters. Things begin to get dicey because the investigators begin to pick up on what Toka is doing, and so they grab Kaneki and try to put Kaneki through an RC cell gate. This way they can tell if a ghoul is inside of their headquarters or not. But luckily, Kaneki is part human, so it doesn't work. The CCG begins to mourn over the investigators they lost, and Hinami begins to do the same, and we see how both sides are suffering from the same consequences. Even as a child, Hinami begins to pick up on this, only to realize that the ghoul investigators are going through the same exact pain that she's feeling, and she comes to this conclusion by reading certain words in the newspaper and applying it to herself. And so she leaves Anteku in order to mourn her mother and comfort herself. Unfortunately, Mato would catch wind of this and take this opportunity to strike. This entire conflict does a lot for Kaneki and Toka's character. We begin to understand exactly why this situation is so personal for Toka. Toka, just like Hinami, had lost her mom to a ghoul investigator, and so she understands Hinami's pain, which is why she is so moved to take revenge in the first place. As a child, Toka felt powerless, and she wants to avoid feeling that same feeling and pain way back when. And Kaneki, just experiencing this same pain, would do anything it takes in order to prevent that experience from happening again, just like with Toka. And unfortunately, both characters had lost their mothers and they could not do anything about it. And this is an aspect that they both share. Kaneki, Hinami, and Toka all share the same pain because they all lost their mothers in their youth while they were powerless. Toka is hell-bent on Hinami killing Mato because Toka could not kill Arima when he killed her mother. And Toka is trying to prevent Hinami from living with that same pain that Toka lived with her entire life. However, what Toka doesn't realize is that Hinami is actually quite different from her because she understands that killing Mato wouldn't make her feel any better. And this is what Yoshimura will be trying to show Toka the entire time. And by killing Mato, they would only cause someone else to feel pain. However, ghoul investigators would definitely be the least of their worries at Anteku. A ghoul, otherwise known as the Gourmet, who specializes in the ghoul underworld, creates a heap of trouble for anyone in his wake. You could easily find him gouging out the eyes of a passerby simply because he would want a specific dinner palette. All in all, he is unpredictable, and Kaneki's scent manages to catch his attention. Like a predator hunting its prey, Tsukiyama manages to find Kaneki at his university. And to get on Kaneki's good side, he talks about books. Little does Kaneki know what Tsukiyama's real intentions are. Kaneki, being caught up in his shared interest of books with Tsukiyama, would otherwise push him to spending time with Tsukiyama. Kaneki would then be walking only to find Yomo and ask him about his training. Yomo mentions to Kaneki that there is someone who wants to meet him, and so they make their rounds and go to that person. And what stands out is how she knows about Kaneki having one eye, and this leads her to bring up the one-eyed king. And we begin to learn that Kaneki could potentially be in danger because he has one eye. And not only that, Kaneki gets to learn a little bit more about his connection to the death of Rize. However, if he wants more information, he's going to have to learn more about the Gourmet, otherwise known as Tsukiyama. To learn more about Rize's death, Kaneki is going to have to trade information for information. While wandering the streets of the 20th Ward, Kaneki finds Nishio getting beat up by other ghouls, and so he takes matters into his own hands and prevents Nishio from getting beat to death. And afterwards, he ends up taking him to his own house and is then ambushed by his girlfriend. And here we get to understand how a regular human being feels about ghouls. Here's where things may be seen as terrible, because this girl kindly turns a blind eye to anybody that this ghoul eats, just as long as they aren't her friends or family. Just as long as it's someone that Nishio's girlfriend doesn't know personally, she will willingly sacrifice their lives to allow Nishio to live. And she does this because she's in love with him, and accordingly, you can see that love does come at a price. Honestly, you could see any human being making this same decision for the ones that they love. Is that morally right or wrong? That is something to think about. And even so, is it morally right for ghouls to eat people just so that they could survive? This makes what Nishio's girlfriend says all the more interesting, admitting that if she would be born a ghoul, she would have also killed people, which would be no different than her sacrificing lives for Nishio's sake right now. Nishio eats people so that he can live, while Nishio's girlfriend allows people to get eaten by Nishio so that he could live. In the end, they are both simply just selfish, doing whatever they can to maintain their love. But what makes this equally disturbing is that Nishio cannot choose whether or not he wants to eat people. Yet Nishio's girlfriend chooses to let him eat other people. Nishio has to kill people, while his girlfriend can choose whether or not she's going to let other people live. It makes you really question, out of the two of them, which one of them is really the immoral one. Society would tell you that Nishio is a monster for eating people, yet we would have a regular human girl allowing others to get killed just for the sake of her love. Are ghouls the immoral ones, or humans? Kaneki then continues with his attempts in getting information from Tsukiyama so he can learn more about Rize's death. In short, Kaneki is trying to use Tsukiyama, and ironically enough, Tsukiyama is trying to do the same thing. Kaneki and Tsukiyama are both trying to get on each other's good sides so that they could make ends meet. Kaneki would associate himself even further with Tsukiyama so that he could get the information he needs, leading him to attend a special restaurant. When doing so, Kaneki and two other humans end up being locked inside. This is when things start to get fishy because the entire room they're in begins to expand into a coliseum. As it turns out, not only Kaneki, but the two other humans he was with were being used. Unbeknownst to some, we would eventually see a darker side from the world of ghouls, having them force humans to mutilate other humans for their own entertainment. They would cook humans alive and feast on them in the heat of the moment. With the other two humans being turned into food, Kaneki would be the last person alive, but Tsukiyama would spare him because he would consider him a delicacy. After experiencing such a tragic event from a more evil side of ghouls, Kaneki would dream of himself being eaten, only to take in the true horror that ghouls are capable of. Nishio's girlfriend goes to Onteku for help because his condition is very critical, and she recognizes Kaneki. After she speaks with Kaneki, Tsukiyama abducts her and he makes a proposal. Tsukiyama wants to eat Kaneki while Kaneki eats Kimi. And of course, this is not gonna turn out his way. At least I hope not, because that would be very disgusting. And so, a brawl ensues, and Kaneki is getting annihilated by Tsukiyama because Tsukiyama obviously has more experience and has been in way more fights than Kaneki, who is a greenhorn to the ghoul world. And Toka would come to Kaneki's rescue yet again, with her introducing herself by slicing Tsukiyama's face. And everyone begins to work together to take Tsukiyama down. And during this fight, we learn a little bit more about Nishio and why he has trust issues. Nishio's older sister had fallen in love with a regular human being, and this same human being would end up betraying Nishio's sister and telling the CCG that she's a ghoul, which would end up costing her her life. Remembering what he lost, and the fear of losing it again would push Nishio further when it comes to stopping Tsukiyama. But being starved would only get Nishio so far, and Tsukiyama would completely obliterate him. And that would leave only Toka and Kaneki to fight Tsukiyama. Toka would bite a piece out of Kaneki, and she would be able to use her Kagune and finally stand up to Tsukiyama, completely defeating him in the process. With that problem dealt with, Kaneki would return to Itori and find out even more information about Rize, ultimately learning that Rize Kamashiro was never her real name. And while wandering the streets, Kaneki would get his wallet stolen, which included his license, his library card, and so much more. And it was stolen by quite the oddball. With life at Onteku, Nishio would end up joining the coffee shop and selling coffee, while the person who just stole Kaneki's wallet would be an investigator for the CCG. With all the action that has died down, ghouls from the 11th Ward would be trying to search for Rize, and their search would lead them to Onteku. A ghoul named Banjo would begin to open up to Kaneki about everything that has been happening in the 11th Ward, and it turns out that ghouls are overrunning the entire place, with the name of the ghoul organization being Aogiri Tree. Crazily enough, more ghouls would end up coming to Onteku, with them ambushing the building itself, with the first ghoul being Toka's brother, Ayato. The relationship between Ayato and Toka is a complicated one. Ayato would want a world that is strictly made for ghouls themselves, and he would believe that Toka is in pursuit for a world that is centered around humans. However, that is not the case entirely. And last but not least, Yamori would end up infiltrating Anteku as well. Yamori would find his way to Anteku because of Rize's scent. Unfortunately, unlike Ayato and Banjo, Yamori is a lot more cruel and confrontational in comparison to Banjo and Ayato, leading him to forcefully capture Kaneki and successfully let Aogiri have their way. Meanwhile, Kaneki's kidnappers decide what they ultimately want to do with him, and they come to the conclusion that Rize is dead, and they deem Kaneki to be worthless, leaving the heads of Aogiri to turn their attentions elsewhere. With this happening, Banjo sees this as an opportunity to allow Kaneki to escape Aogiri's clutches. With time passing, Yamori begins to take an interest in Kaneki, specifically because he has one ghoul eye, which is reminiscent to that of the One-Eyed King, which makes sense as to why Yamori would want to defeat Kaneki. Yamori would want strength, and by defeating Kaneki, his own strength would be all the more believable. When night falls, Banjo, Kaneki, and the rest of the ghouls make their attempt at an escape from Aogiri's hideout. In doing so, they would attract the attention of the Bin brothers, forcing them to fight for their freedom. But this isn't the least of their worries. Yamori just so happens to be nearby. Yamori had known about this entire escape plan the whole time, and this is because Nico overheard them having an anti-Aogiri rally. Yamori makes his rounds by killing plenty of the other people that were trying to escape, and this hurts Banjo deeply. Yamori expresses his sole interest in Kaneki, and he forces Kaneki to make a deal, bargaining that if Kaneki were to serve him, he would let the rest of the ghouls escape freely. Kaneki doesn't trust Yamori, but he agrees to his proposal simply because he wants to save the other people around him. Next, we have everyone at Anteku planning a rescue mission to save Kaneki, with everyone in Anteku willing to risk their lives for Kaneki. They would end up making a few unexpected allies in the process, and the raid on Aogiri's hideout would begin with the CCG and Anteku taking full force at their building. However, little does anyone realize what exactly Kaneki is going through at this moment. Kaneki had agreed to become Yamori's subordinate, but he was anything but that. Kaneki had become a torture victim. As a ghoul, his limbs would regenerate, so this made the torture all the more painful. He would repeat the process of getting his fingers and toes cut off, day by day, only to have them grow back slowly so he could repeat feeling the same pain over and over again. Yet, there was a reason why Kaneki was experiencing this. It wasn't simply because Yamori was a sick freak. No, it was more than that. Yamori wanted to teach Kaneki a lesson. After all, out of everyone in Aogiri, Yamori was the only one who understood Kaneki's potential. Simply put, Yamori had seen himself within Kaneki. This led him to challenge and change Kaneki's worldview. Yamori would inflict the same pain that he felt when he was tortured onto Kaneki, and they would both end up sharing the same pain. However, while Yamori was tortured, he was able to end up escaping this pain, which was only possible due to the strength of his insanity. Yamori would lose his mind and end up believing that he is not the person being tortured, but instead, he's the person that he's being tortured by. Yamori would force Kaneki to relate with him in this aspect. Just like Yamori, Kaneki would go insane. Rather than being the person that is being tortured, Kaneki would become the person that is torturing him. Kaneki would become Yamori. And to showcase this, Kaneki would crack his fingers just like Yamori. This is because Kaneki is Yamori. The CCG and Anteku would continue with their infiltration while Kaneki would leave Yamori for dead, considering him not worth killing. Juzo would later show up and finish Kaneki's job, only to finish off Yamori. The CCG would run into Yoshimura during their infiltration, and they'd be running into a powerhouse ghoul known as the Owl. Shinohara and Kuroiwa would end up using their Queen K Arata prototypes in order to take down the Owl, and these suits would enhance their physical abilities and speed to another level entirely. This would lead the two siblings to fight each other, and during this fight, Toka would reminisce about her past and the promise she and her brother made to her father. with Ayato's promise being to protect his sister and Toka's promise being to teach things to Ayato, while their father would promise to never leave them. Unfortunately, every promise between this family would end up being broken, with Ayato and Toka's father never returning, while Ayato, rather than protecting his sister, he would be the very one to beat her down, while Toka would fail to teach Ayato the qualities of human beings. With Toka defeated, Kaneki would come to her rescue, much like how she saved him many times before. Kaneki would plan to beat Ayato half to death. Even after breaking his promise to an extent, Kaneki can still see that Ayato still loves Toka, and so he didn't finish his sister off. However, this wouldn't stop Kaneki from breaking half of every bone in Ayato's body, with only his bare hands. One of Aogiri's strongest members, Noro, would show up and see that Kaneki has defeated Ayato. From here on, Yomo would stop Kaneki from fighting because he fought so much already. With that being said, Yomo, Tsukiyama, and Uda would all team up against Noro. They would attack Noro a few times, but Noro would then escape and leave with Ayato. The CCG and Amon would continue infiltrating the rest of the hideout, with Amon defeating 2 Aogiri members by himself, with them being the Bin brothers. During all of this, Shinohara and Kuroiwa would still be fighting the owl. That is, until the owl makes a hasty retreat, leaving Shinohara's Arata to eat him alive. Yoshimura would run away because he wants to avoid killing people as much as possible. Aogiri would lose their hideout and suffer the loss of 200 of their men, with the CCG ultimately winning the battle. With everything over, Kaneki would decide to leave on Teku, with Banjo and Tsukiyama joining his ranks and his path to becoming stronger. Kaneki would leave everyone so that he could be strong enough to protect them in the future. 6 months would pass, and the CCG would be led to believe that they defeated Aogiri Tree. However, this would not be the case because Aogiri had used that hideout as bait so that Aogiri could attack the Ghoul Detention Center in the 23rd Ward and take control of it. With all the conflict dying down, Juzo would ascend to the rank of Rank 2 Investigator, and Amon would take his downtime to visit Mato's grave. Coincidentally, he would also run into Mato's daughter, who would end up working under him. Amon and Mato would be working together, and they would eventually find out that Kaneki had destroyed a ghoul restaurant, butchering every ghoul in sight. Meanwhile, at the CCG's laboratory, Juzo would end up being rewarded with a Queen K, with it being in the shape of a scythe, and of course, he would be able to do more than enough damage with it. Furthering their investigation, Amon and Mato would end up questioning Donato. And with this interrogation, Donato would completely see through Amon, and we can understand 2 different sides of Amon's character, with us getting more reasoning as to why he wears the cross around his neck. Donato would claim that the cross that Amon wears would be a symbol of the love he has for his foster father, while Amon would deny his statement, claiming that it's a symbol of his repentance and his ignorance. With that being said, we would see a shifting side between Amon's emotions and his character. There's a part of him that loves his foster father and another part of him that hates him. Figuring out Amon's true feelings is what makes his character all the more compelling. Kaneki's best friend Hide would also end up joining the CCG. And with time, we would begin to see the auction that Amon had been investigating, where he immediately identified that Kaneki was the murderer at the auction. Thanks to Kaneki allying with Tsukiyama, this gave him the opportunity to actually kill sadistic ghouls. The sole reason why Kaneki would do this is because he would be trying to capture Madame A. Madame A would be Kaneki's sole target because she would inevitably lead him to Dr. Kano. What would be the connection between the two? Well, you see, Madame A would bring scrappers to the auction and they would be unusually bloated, and so Tsukiyama would come to the conclusion that this would be from human experimentation. And as we all already know, Kaneki is a human experiment himself, which would make Madame A the only lead they have to go off of, simply because the scrappers are human experiments and so is Kaneki. With his attempt to capture Madame A, Kaneki will be stopped by 2 other one-eyed ghouls that would be just like him. With this, we would know that Dr. Kano is completely involved. After this, Kaneki would be finding more leads and try to understand who Rize actually is. This would give Kaneki a lead on Rize's foster father, Shachi. Most of you would commonly recognize him as Orca. Kaneki would come to understand that in order to find out more about Rize, he would have to know more about Shachi and the 6th Ward. With that being said, Shachi's underling Gil would not take kindly to Kaneki, because Kaneki would remind him of Rize, and Rize would be the reason as to why Shachi would be locked up in the first place. Rize would eat countless people in the 6th Ward, and this would bring attention to all of the ghouls that were living in the ward. And so the CCG would attack and successfully take Shachi in the aftermath. Kaneki would still be on a personal pursuit for more information. He would go to his best informant, which we all already know is Itori, and pry for more information on Dr. Kano. There would end up being a surprise guest at the bar, with it being Nico, which would cause Kaneki to be very uncomfortable in his presence because he would be reminded of Yamori and Aogiri. As it turns out, Nico doesn't actually work for Aogiri, he was simply there because he liked Yamori's presence. In his words, he really just wanted to see something beautiful. Kaneki would end up getting information out of Nico, and he would learn a lead on who the One-Eyed King is. The next day, Kaneki would train Banjo how to fight. And of course, Banjo would be very unsuccessful when it comes to beating Kaneki in practice. Soon after, we begin to understand why Hinami left on Teku, and she does this because she wants to be there for Kaneki like how Toka was there for her, so that she wouldn't feel lonely after her mother passed away. Getting down to business, Tsukiyama suggests that they go to the 20th Ward and try to find a lead from Dr. Kano's hospital directly. While at the hospital, they're informed that Dr. Kano is traveling overseas, in Germany to be exact. And as it turns out, this same day also happens to be Toka's birthday, and due to the occasion, Hinami goes to see Toka. Unfortunately, Kaneki does not do the same, but he does give Toka's friend a keychain to give to Toka as a gift. Kaneki distances himself so that he could keep Toka from getting involved into the ghoul world. As it turns out, the nurse actually lied to Kaneki about Dr. Kano being overseas. And to make matters worse, the CCG are finding connections between Dr. Kano and the accident with Rize. The hunt for Dr. Kano would continue, with Kaneki planning to capture the nurse that lied to them at the hospital so they can figure out where Dr. Kano is actually hiding. However, another group would end up trying to capture the nurse that Kaneki set his eyes on. Rize's foster father Shachi makes an appearance and completely defeats Kaneki, only to successfully capture the nurse that everyone had their hopes on. Kaneki would be defeated and be back at square one at trying to find Dr. Kano. This leaves Kaneki to fall back on his other lead, with that being Madam A. Accurately to Tsukiyama's assumptions, without a doubt, Madam A was actually looking after Dr. Kano's lab experiments and using them at the ghoul restaurants. Dr. Kano would offer her this opportunity right after she would try killing him. And after an abrupt chase, Kaneki would end up getting his hands on Madam A. The next morning, ghoul investigators would visit on Teku, and they would do this in order to get information on Kaneki, and this would cause the investigators to grow suspicious of Onteku. Meanwhile, Banjo and Tsukiyama would inform Shachi's underlings that he's now working with Aogiri. Kaneki would begin training so that he could face off against Shachi in the future. Madam A would then lead Kaneki to Dr. Kano's base. While there, we would learn more about Kuro and Shiro. We would learn that Dr. Kano's base would be the original home of both of the twins that he turned into one-eyed ghouls, through experimentation no less. Unfortunately, a ghoul had eaten their mother, and in a fit of rage, their father would try to retaliate against the ghoul, but he would also be eaten, leaving the mansion completely abandoned. Deep in the recesses of the mansion, they would find an RC cell wall, and they would be led to where Dr. Kano is hiding inside of the mansion, just to be ambushed by Shiro, Kuro, and a ton of Kano's experiments. Kaneki would separate from the group, while Tsukiyama would be left alone to fight Kuro and Shiro. Kaneki would finally get his rematch with Shachi in the process. Shachi's overwhelming strength would completely leave Kaneki nearly defenseless, which would force Kaneki to have to adapt to Shachi's fighting style. Kaneki would then force Shachi into using his Kagune, and the fight would completely escalate. Deeper in the lab occupying their mansion, Kuro and Shiro would run into the leader of Aogiri, Edo. and she would touch upon the fact that Dr. Kano is simply manipulating both Kuro and Shiro, and that they only allow him to do such a thing because he simply fills the void for the father that they lost. Kaneki and Shachi's battle would end up leading them directly to Dr. Kano, leading us to finally realize where Rize has been the entire time. Dr. Kano would then ask Kaneki to join him within Aogiri, and we would know that Yoshimura has an involvement with Aogiri's creation as a whole. Yomo would then rescue Rize, and the CCG would infiltrate Dr. Kano's hideout. Shachi would stop Kaneki from attacking Dr. Kano, and so Kaneki would start feasting on the test subjects that Kano created, and this would make Kaneki completely lose his self in a fit of rage, causing him to take the form of that of a centipede, the source of his trauma. The CCG and the rest of the ghouls would end up trying to kill each other. With Juzo fighting Kuro and Shiro, they would begin to feel very nostalgic. As it turns out, Juzo was abducted by a ghoul as a child, and the CCG would take him in to raise him as an investigator. However, corpses of dead animals were spread all throughout the campus, and Juzo would be accused to take the blame. Kuro and Shiro would inevitably end up blaming Juzo for killing all the animals. And years later, Juzo would finally be able to retaliate by fighting both of them right now. Juzo would eviscerate one of the twins, which would cause them to retreat. All the while, Kaneki is losing himself to his own insanity. Kaneki would throw himself away, all so that he could finally face up against Aogiri. Kaneki, who was against hurting others, would finally end up hurting others so that he could protect the people around him. Kaneki would make specific sacrifices, all for the people that he loved. Shinohara would battle for his life against Kaneki, but to no avail. Kaneki would be too strong and begin devouring Shinohara. In a fit of rage, Amon would then immediately try attacking Kaneki. Kaneki would remind Amon of his past, and he would reminisce about the duality between ghouls and humans. However, as a human being, he would immediately think that ghouls are the problem with the world. Amon would attack Kaneki one more time and then allow him to escape. Once he's safe, Kaneki would then take out his pain and frustration on his allies. A cool part of this is that Kaneki went out of his way to hurt others so that he could protect the people around him. However, in the end, he only ended up hurting the same people he was trying to protect. After being attacked by Kaneki, Banjo would then develop a Kagune of his own, and would help Kaneki come back to his senses by telling him that before he has to save anyone else, he has to first save himself. The CCG would not suffer any casualties from Kaneki's outrage, but Amon would be completely disappointed in Juzo and his lack of compassion for Shinohara, which lets us know how they both see their comrades. And the following day, Kaneki begins to think about what he had just done. And in order to deal with his emotions at the moment in time, he begins to read a book, and Hinami is reading the same book, so she gives Kaneki the idea of going to a book signing. And in order to change his mood, Kaneki would gladly go. And naturally, after meeting his favorite author, he would be very happy. Amon would then think about everything that had just happened and would recognize one of the one-eyed ghouls in the laboratory as Kurona from the CCG's academy. Daily life would go on, and we would see Takizawa get drunk. And boy, does his night get ruined. Let's just say he picked up the phone at the worst time imaginable. Mato, just like Takizawa, also happens to be drunk, and she would go as far as to say that she hates Amon and blames him for her father's death. And Amon, being who he is, would take full responsibility for everything that happened. Amon would then escort Mato home, and things would slowly begin to escalate. With Mato breaking down in front of Amon, Amon would then begin to process his surroundings so that he could become stronger and also bear Mato's weight. Meanwhile, Kaneki would go to Uda for more information so that he could understand why Kano would say Yoshimura would have birthed Aogiri Tree. Kaneki wouldn't get many answers when it comes to Yoshimura, but he would learn a lot more about Yomo. Uda would reminisce about how reckless the younger Yomo was, with Yomo being so power hungry that he would stop at nothing so that he could accomplish his goal of killing Arima. As it would turn out, Yomo would actually be a lot like Ayato in the sense that he would grow up with his older sister being the tougher one to handle situations that he would think to be very scary, with Yomo's relationship with his sister being the same relationship that Ayato would share with Toka, which would make them the same. Arima at the age of 16 would kill Yomo's sister, and finally, in the future, Yomo would have his opportunity at revenge. And with Uda working together with Yomo, their chances would be even higher. In a fit of rage, Yomo would immediately attack Arima, while Arima would be the exact opposite and completely keep his cool, while this entire fight would end in Yomo's defeat, with Yoshimura saving Yomo and taking him under his wing. After learning this, Kaneki would then approach Yomo and ask him if he could see Rize. Yomo would warn Kaneki at first, but Kaneki would still push on and demand to see her, only to finally see her in the worst condition she's ever possibly been in. Kaneki would then try to speak with her, however her mind would be so far gone that none of his words would ever reach her. Tsukiyama, Hinami, Toka, and Nishio would all meet up and decide that they should all help Kaneki. Toka would then search for Kaneki, only to confuse him with Furuta, who was attending their campus, and she would meet up with Hide. Kaneki would then question Yoshimura in order to figure out if Yoshimura's child is the One-Eyed King, or more accurately, the One-Eyed Owl. Yoshimura would then tell Kaneki about his life and how he used to kill humans and ghouls alike for the V organization. Yoshimura would be a cleaner and simply kill anyone he was told to kill. Deep down, he was really just alone. This would be until he meets his wife, and then they would have a half-human, half-ghoul child. Toka would then finally catch up to Kaneki, and he would push for his ideal of wanting to protect everyone around him. But in the end, he would only be protecting himself because he would not want to lose the people around him, so he would not ever be alone again. Toka, noticing Kaneki's selfishness, would only frustrate her, and this would end up in her trying to fight him. Toka would tell Kaneki to never come back to Onteku, and their argument would end with her walking away. Kaneki would then want to disband the group he made with Tsukiyama, Banjo, and Hinami, and decide to go back to Onteku. He would even suggest that everyone should go with him. And in a series of unfortunate events, the CCG would commence an attack on Onteku so that they could get their hands on the owl. Before the chaos ensues, we get to understand more about Juzo's character, with a look at his backstory. Juzo would be heavily traumatized, and he would have been a scrapper for Big Madam, where he would be tortured and then forced to kill people for the sake of entertainment. His story would only get worse as Big Madam would force him to dress up as a female for pleasure, and one fateful night would end up in Juzo's manhood being completely crushed. The CCG would then take Juzo in and raise him as an investigator. At night, Juzo would find a man that was killing animals on campus. Juzo would then get framed for these same killings. Before the final operation to take down the owl, Juzo would draw giraffes to really showcase how much he loves animals, and Shinohara would take note of this, and say to Juzo that he would be sad if he ended up dying, which is the exact opposite of the way Juzo felt when he thought Shinohara was dead in the laboratory. With this, we would see how all the other CCG operatives would be handling their time before such a life-endangering mission. While writing his will, Takizawa would find himself having a mental breakdown, pushing him to shed tears and piss himself, while Juzo, on the other hand, would simply write his will and throw it into the wind as a paper airplane. Amon and Mato would visit her father's grave, which lets us know the weight of this operation that lies on Mato's shoulders, with the owl being the very person that started the cycle of revenge that Amon's mentor had gotten swallowed by. While opening up about her father, Mato would inch closer to Amon for a kiss, and he would deny her. Yoshimura would be confronted by the mysterious group known as V, and they would demand that he hands over his daughter. Of course, being the great father that he is, Yoshimura would never do such a thing. Everyone at Onteku and the CCG would prepare for what would seem to be like their last moments. All-out warfare with ghouls and the CCG would take place, with the Devil Apes and Black Dogs teaming up together to fight their common enemy, with that being the CCG. Yoshimura would then take to the front lines in order to defend the peaceful home that everyone at Onteku worked so hard to build. Shinohara and Kuroiwa would end up having their long-awaited rematch with the Owl. Surveying the chaos, Kaneki would then make up his mind and finally join the fray. Nishio would also decide to join the battle with him. However, Tsukiyama would make an attempt to prevent Kaneki from risking his own life. And of course, it doesn't really go out as planned. Once again, Shinohara and Kuroiwa rush the Owl. However, there is a slight change. Juzo would join them in order to take the Owl's head. During all of this, Toka would try and join the battle as well, but Yomo would prevent her from doing so. Toka would feel guilty from all of the lives that she's taken, and so she would want to fight in battle not only to protect the ones that she loves, but also as punishment for all of the sins that she committed. Unfortunately, Toka is someone who has to live, suffering through all of the losses that she has experienced. Meanwhile, the leader of the Black Dogs would face off against Hachikawa. Even though Hachikawa is a member of the CCG, he will do whatever it takes to take down a ghoul, no matter how dirty a tactic may seem. Hachikawa would use an old woman as bait, and with the leader of the Black Dogs having a heart, she would jump in the way of his attack and ultimately suffer from protecting the elderly. Ironically enough, a CCG member was attacking a person that they should protect, while a ghoul was defending a person that they should be eating. This would go to show just how complex the relationship between ghouls and humans really are. Before the leader of the Black Dogs is completely finished off, Kaneki would come to her rescue. He would also save the leader of the Devil Apes from his battle as well. The leader of the Black Dogs would tell Kaneki the location of the Owl and all the special investigators battling him. He would then make his way to protect Yoshimura. Much like before when Kaneki was preventing Amon from saving Mado, this situation would just so happen to be the opposite, because rather than Kaneki blocking Amon's path, Amon would now be blocking Kaneki's path. Amon's path to Mado was blocked, now Kaneki's path to Yoshimura is blocked. Starting the fight, Kaneki would completely overwhelm Amon, and Amon would be forced to use an auto-equipping Arata. With Amon's physical strength, he would be able to draw out the full capabilities of his Arata unit, and this would push Kaneki to use his Centipede Kakuja. During all of this, the special investigators would continue their push against the Owl. Juzo would recklessly push on the offensive attack, only to lose his leg in battle. Shinohara would show compassion and sadness over Juzo's loss of his leg, when before Juzo did not show that same courtesy. Back to Kaneki and Amon, they would both share one last colliding attack. Kaneki would tear off Amon's arm, while Amon would destroy Kaneki's chances of regenerating for the rest of the battle, all the while having a hole in half of his entire body. Kaneki would push on in pain in order to save Yoshimura. The CCG would then confirm the eradication of the Owl, only for a mysterious giant one-eyed monster to appear out of nowhere. This same monster would actually be the true Owl. In the midst of this, Takizawa would disobey orders so that he could search for Amon. Kaneki would find himself in the sewers, only to lose self-control due to his hunger pains. Hide would end up finding Kaneki in the sewers, and just like in the beginning, after fighting Nishio, Kaneki would be face to face with his friend, and he would have to fight the same urge of eating him that he had experienced before. Kaneki would then take a bite out of his friend. It's really hard to determine what would happen next. The rest of the special investigators would begin fighting this true Owl. This true Owl would cut off Shinohara's leg, just like Juzo's leg, only to mock him and then devour it. After seeing such a thing, Juzo would begin to feel the same compassion and sadness that Shinohara had felt for him. After suffering starvation and eating his friend, Kaneki would finally come face to face with Arima. While embracing him, Kaneki would feel an utter sensation of death. Going back to Juzo, he would fight the true one-eyed owl all by himself with only one leg. Kaneki's feeling of death from Arima would be one of the most certain feelings he would ever experience. With his brain being impaled, Kaneki would be utterly defeated by Arima. Kaneki would traverse deep into the recesses of his mind and compare his life to that of his own mother, acknowledging that he would be a selfish, timid coward because he would simply be afraid of being alone the entire time. Kaneki only cared for others out of his own selfishness because he wanted them around so he wouldn't be lonely. While digging even deeper into his mind, Kaneki would remember the mask of a clown at the site of Rize's death. Takizawa would find Amon. Unfortunately, he would run into probably the worst ghoul he could possibly face, with that being Tadara. At the very sight of Tadara, Takizawa would quiver in fear, and Amon would still get up even with the loss of his arm in order to protect Takizawa. Spurred by Amon's actions and a constant lack of involvement would cause Takizawa to raise his weapon to take down Tadara. Tadara would immediately notice that Takizawa's Queen K would be made out of his own brother's Kagune, and this would enrage Tadara, causing Tadara to feed Takizawa to Noro in order to get back at Hoji, the man who killed Tadara's brother. The True Owl would eviscerate a majority of the CCG and then come face to face with Arima. The True Owl would devour Yoshimura and make a quick escape away from Arima. The True Owl would then release its monster state, and it would turn out that this True Owl had actually been Yoshimura's daughter the entire time. At the end of it all, Takizawa and Amon would be found dead, and Hide would be missing. Shinohara would be left in a coma, while Juzo would be handicapped. The rest of the CCG would mourn the losses of both Amon and Takizawa. Shinohara would then become Juzo's reason for pushing on through life. Arima would then gain a new apprentice known as Heisei Sasaki. Uda and the rest of the clowns would begin to plan to cause more chaos throughout Tokyo, all for the sake of their own fun. Anteku would be completely destroyed, yet Toka would still believe that Kaneki will one day return to that same coffee shop.